we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. You are in for a real treat, and I can say that now because I became familiar with Todd's work around visual thinking during a presentation he gave only a little while back at the Institute of Coaching. And of course, I had to reach out, and he generously agreed to share his insights here with us today. I want to share a few words about Todd for those who are being introduced to his work for the first time. Todd Cherches is the CEO and co-founder of Big Blue Gumball, an innovative New York City-based leadership development and executive coaching firm. He is a member of Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100 Coaches. Todd was nominated there in 2021 by Thinkers 50 as one of 8 global finalists for their Distinguished Achievement Award in Leadership, and was recently named by Thinkers 360 as one of the world's top 50 thinkers and influencers in the field of management. Todd is also a 3-time award-winning adjunct professor at leadership at NYU, as well as a lecturer on leadership at Columbia University. And lastly, Todd is a TEDx speaker and the author of the groundbreaking book, Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and in Life, which was published in 2020. And please join me now in welcoming Todd Cherches.
Pisha, thank you so much for having me. And as I was just mentioning earlier, I'm coming to you live from New York. It's not Saturday Night Live, but live from New York. But I did live in LA for 10 years and spent a lot of time in Orange County while I was out there. And as I was saying, mainly going to Yankees games to see them play the Angels. So sorry about that, Angels fans. But great to be with you. I feel like we're communicating across country, which is the power of Zoom. And I talk loud and fast because I'm from New York, because I'm a New Yorker, but I'm by nature an extreme introvert. I always say I'm a 3 Bs kind of guy, a back of the room, behind the scenes bookworm. And you could tell from all of the books on my bookshelf that I am not lying about that. I've been reading an average of 1 business book a week since 1998. So that's about 50 a year over 24 years. So I've passed over 1,200 business books that I've read. So after reading so many, people started saying, when are you going to write your own book? And I finally wrote my own book called Visual Leadership, which I'll hold up here for a second. 2 years ago, and you're going to receive some of the highlights of my book today. But we want to target and focus on coaching because this is ICF. I'm an ICF member here in New York. So we want to talk about how can coaches, and whether you're a coach of an executive coach, presentation skills coach, life coach, whatever kind of coaching you do, how could you use visuals and visual thinking in your practice? So that's our focus for today. So my first question for you is, what does this visual image have to do with coaching? So in the chat box, let's make this as interactive and engaging as possible. At certain times, we're going to open up the mics. I encourage you to turn your cameras on. I always talk about 3 Vs: visibility, voice, and value. If you want to be seen, if you want to be heard, and you want to make a contribution, you need to have your cameras on. You need to have your mics on when invited, or speak through the chat and make a contribution. I always say that the success of any workshop or class is 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 equals 100%. 1/3 is my content, 1/3 is my facilitation, and 1/3 is your contribution. So if you're not contributing, you're only getting 2/3 of the value of this webinar. So hopefully we'll get some interactivity and contributions in the chat box and through spoken communication. So my first question is, what does this have to do with coaching? So Kyler kicked us off. Like coaches help get their customers, clients where they're going, but faster. Nicely done, Kyler. Transporting takes you on a journey, moving forward. What else? Let's keep adding to it. In what other ways? We're going to talk about metaphors today. How is this coaching a metaphor? Think about the word coach. Here's a stagecoach. We fly coach on an airplane. There's even coach handbags. What does those uses of the word coach have to do with what we all do for a living? I love that. Sandy, create a vehicle to move forward. So sitting down with the client, take a break and reflect. I love it. Thank you, Jan. Excellent. So I am an English literature major, or I was in college, and I'm obsessed with word origins. So I once looked up the definition of what does a stagecoach have to do with coaching? And this is what I found. Does anyone know the origin of the word coach? You get extra bonus points if you could tell us the origin of the word coach. You can either put it in the chat, or you can turn on your mic and shout it out. Does anyone know? where the word coach comes from? 3, 2, 1. Does someone want to take a guess? It is a vehicle, but where did this vehicle come from? Let me reveal that to you. So this English word came from this French word, which came from this German word, which came from this Hungarian word, which came from the city of Koch, Hungary, which is right here on our map. And believe it or not, I once had a participant a few weeks ago who actually said, I grew up in Koch, Hungary. That's never happened to me in my entire life, but there you go. And what happened in Koch, Hungary? Back in the 1400s, this is where the stagecoach, the first horse-drawn carriages, were invented. So here's my little visual here. Let's watch this go. I just figured out how to do this. So a little visual demonstration. So if you think, so what became known and spread throughout Europe as the cart of coach was this vehicle that helped people get from point A to point B. That later became a metaphor for us as coaches. And our job is to help our clients get from point A to point B better, faster, more efficiently, more effectively than they would on their own. So our job as coaches to kind of be a stagecoach driver, or maybe even a passenger, but help to transport our people, our clients on their journey, right? So that is where, I always love that. That is where the word coach comes from. So the question for today is, how can you become a more visual coach? How can you apply visual coaching techniques in your coaching practice? So visual coaching is a new frontier. It's a new way of looking at coaching. It's a new way of doing coaching. And in fact, I presented at Columbia University's coaching conference in 2021, and the theme was advancing frontiers in coaching. And my co-presentation with my colleague Yaron, we presented on visual coaching, and that was more of an academic conference. Today is more practical applications of how you can use coaching in your practice. So visual coaching, very simply, is the application of visual thinking to the practice of coaching. So that, if you look at this Venn diagram, which is a visual model, and we're going to be talking about visual models shortly, this is just a general overview of what we're talking about today, which brings up the question, what is visual thinking? What do we mean by visual thinking? So if you would, in the chat box, tell us your best definition or description of what we mean when we talk about visual thinking. So let's turn again to the chat box. So Andrew, we see it in our mind. Yes. What else? What else do we mean by visual thinking? Thinking in images. Yes. Thank you, Jan. Words create images for us. Yep. What else? Thinking in pictures. Thank you, Nana. Visual communication, metaphors and stories. Yes, Lori, definitely. What else? All right, so wherever you are, let's pick it up from there. So in a nutshell, which is a metaphor, by the way, which means what? To see something in a small, concise way. Visual thinking in a nutshell is about thinking in pictures. So a couple of you already said that. So thinking in pictures as opposed to just words or images. So often in business, we read Word documents, a lot of text, Excel spreadsheets, a lot of numbers. Visual communication is about translating those words and numbers into images so that other people can see what we're saying. So that's the bottom line of what we're trying to do with visual thinking, is getting ideas out of our head and into someone else's head so that they can see what we're saying. I always talk about 3 F's: facts, figures, and feelings, right? People are not motivated by facts and figures. They're motivated and inspired by feelings. So this brings everything together. How do we unite facts, figures, and feelings in such a way that we can be more effective? So if visual thinking is about thinking in pictures, visual communication is about communicating with pictures, right? So in order to communicate visually, we first need to think visually, right? So it's about thinking in pictures, communicating with pictures, and this is using both visual imagery and or visual language. So it's not always imagery that we could take in through our eye. Sometimes we can take in visual imagery through our ear, as in stories, right? Hamlet said when he saw the ghost of his father in Shakespeare's play Hamlet, "Methinks I see my father in my mind's eye," right? He didn't know if he was seeing the actual ghost of his father or if it was a figment of his imagination, but he still saw it. He saw it in his mind's eye. So that's what our challenge is how do we get our ideas out of our mind's eye and into the eyes of our clients, and vice versa? how can we be better not only speakers, but better and coaches, but better listeners, and extracting some of those images and stories from our clients. So if you think about it this way, we have an idea, right? An idea pops into our head, an idea, a thought, a question. We need to figure out how are we going to frame this idea. And we talk about framing and reframing a lot in coaching. How are we going to frame this idea in such a way that we can get that idea out of our head and into the heads of the other person so that they can say, I see what you're saying. And if you think about it, that is what every communication is about, whether it's an email, a TED Talk, a webinar like this. It doesn't matter. We're trying to get other people to see what we're saying, right? So they not only need to hear it, but we also want them to see it. Bernard Baruch said that the ability to express an idea is as important as the idea itself. If we can't express it, then that idea is not going to be able to change a person or change the world. So our goals for today, our learning objectives, are to talk about the what and why of visual thinking. What's it all about? I want to introduce to you my 4 ways of thinking more visually and communicating more visually. And throughout, we want to weave through the thread of what are the real life coaching applications. This is not just academic or theoretical. These are real tools, tips, and techniques that I teach in my leadership classes, as well as using in my coaching practice. So as Petra said earlier, I'm a member of Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100 Coaches. My company is called Big Blue Gumball, which is a metaphor that represents the world. The world is like a big blue gumball, however we want to look at it. And our mission is to make the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to us, everyone is a leader, even if you're just leading your own life, right? So we start with that assumption. I teach leadership at NYU in the HR Master's program. And I was just saying, before coming on today, is I just did a 45-minute webinar before this, and I'm teaching my 3-hour leadership class right after this. So I hope I still have some voice left by the end of tonight. So at NYU, I teach leadership in the HR Master's program. At Columbia, I teach in a few different programs, including leadership for Broadway stage managers in their MFA theater program, which lets me incorporate some Shakespeare and some show tunes into what I do over there. So, but regardless of what I do, it always involves visual thinking and visual communication. If you want to learn more, check out my TED Talk, which you can find on my website, toddcherches.com. It's on the power of visual thinking. And my book, Visual Leadership, was just released by Post Hill Press, Simon & Schuster in 2020. And you're going to see some highlights of that today. So with that, let's turn. I just figured out how to do that. Let's do this one more time visually. This is one of the most fun. This is one of the highlights of my day when I figured out. So let's turn the page and let's get started. So I want to turn it over to you now. I want to pose this question, and we're going to put you in breakout groups just for a few minutes, but we want you to get a chance to, first of all, meet someone else. Secondly, to think about and to share, in what ways do you currently incorporate visuals, visual thinking, or visual communication into your coaching practice? You may say, I don't, I never really even thought about it, or I do, and here's how. So Nano is going to set you up in breakout rooms right now. We're going to put you into groups of 2. If there's an odd number, there may be a group of 3, but most likely a group of 2. You only have 4 minutes in the breakout. So 2 minutes per person to briefly introduce yourself and then to share, this is how I use visuals in my coaching practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nanor, and I'll see you back here in about 4 minutes.
Very quickly, Todd, I just want to double check. Did you want to go into a breakout room or no?
No, I don't need to. You could keep me out.
Okay, then okay, I'll go ahead. So it's going to put you in one. Don't accept it.
Sounds good.
And then, yeah. All right. I'm going to.
See you all in about 4 minutes.
Okay. All right. Sharon, don't go in. Oh, she already went. 1 second. I'm going to stop recording. I can find it. Okay, you guys are trickling back. The vacuum is bringing you back. I can't hear everything you're saying, Sharon. Say it again.
There's a visual image being sucked back.
Oh, there you go.
All right, so we'd like to do right now, let's just get I wish we could go around, if this was like a 3-hour workshop, we can go around and get everyone's input, but let's just get a few samples. So Nana, why don't you kick us off and share, how do you use visuals in your coaching practice? Just, 1 or 2 examples.
Yeah, so I was just sharing with Todd that one thing that I've been doing more of is really paying attention to a metaphor that the client will have used in the coaching, and then bringing that back and extrapolating on that. And then the other is if I have a tool, I make sure that that tool has some sort of visual with it. And, and then I'll share that with the client as well.
All right, great.
So-
Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about metaphors shortly and the power of metaphors as a coaching tool. But same thing with, as you're talking about, we're overloaded with content. And when things are all text or people don't read it, bullet points, paragraphs. But if you have a visual, you could find that piece of paper. You're more likely to hang it up on a wall or something. So the power of using a visual in association with text is very effective. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Let's hear a few others. Andrew, you put in, they use graphic models. Do you want to share an example of what you do? You're on mute. You're on mute.
I use flip charts for everything. Even I was just saying with my group, I'll grab a piece of paper here and I'll grab my little felt marker and I'll start drawing.
Great.
Okay, well, I'm going to do the wheel of life here. Let's talk about these different pieces. I do that all the time when I'm doing Zoom calls.
Love it. Love it.
And in person with flip charts as well.
Great. Speaking of that, we are going to do some drawing exercises. So make sure you have some paper and a pen handy because we're going to be getting to that shortly. Thank you, Andrew. Someone else, give us an example. We get just a few samples of how you use visuals in your practice. Anyone else? Turn on your mic and just jump in.
Well, I don't, I have not incorporated this practice, but I do something called soul collage.
Okay.
It's an actual registered trademarked thing created by a woman named Zena Frost. And it's basically using magazines and imagery to cut out and create a collage, but not like a vision board. It's very limited to a 5x8 card backing. And it's just expressing an energy, one energy that someone is feeling or is coming up. So
great, I love it. Thank you, Erica. Yeah, the power of pictures to communicate, to elicit emotion is very powerful. Center for Creative Leadership has these card decks, visual explorer cards, and there's all kinds of ways you can use those. You can show an image. You could say, all right, which image represents how I'm feeling today, or something like that. So I love that. You can create a vision board and cut out pictures from magazines and say, all right, here's my picture of how I see my life in the future. So I love what Erica said. That's just another way of using visual imagery to communicate and to elicit emotions. Let's get a couple of others. Let's get two more examples. Who wants to share with us your examples?
This is Gordon.
Okay.
What Wes and I were talking about, one example I gave is when I work with a particular client, I found that using the technique of having him imagine he is in a place he wants to be in a work setting where he was the most successful and where he was feeling that he was most engaged, and then have him or her describe what that is and really talk about that setting and actually go there and then use that as a way to identify what are the things that he or she find the most effective, as well as the most who they are.
That's great. I love it. Yeah. So using visualization is a way, right? Picturing something in your mind's eye. There's that phrase, act as if, right? There's a saying, act as if you already have that quality and you will embody that quality, right? So that's a great example of picturing yourself in a job or sitting at a desk or working on a beach or whatever that is. It kind of, not that, just by putting it out there into the universe doesn't magically make it happen. There is no magic wand, right? We need to do the work. But if you have a picture in your mind's eye of possibilities, you're more likely to take steps in that direction towards making that reality, that vision of reality. So thank you. Let's get one more. Who wants to share one other example? And if we didn't get to you, please put it in the chat, because I love, it's hard for me to keep up with the chat, but I always print out and read the chat comments afterwards. So we would love for you to share all your thoughts in the chat. But let's get one more if someone wants to turn on their mic and share how you use visuals in your practice. Anyone?
I will.
Okay, Sandy.
This kind of came about by accident, but I was working with an engineering client on her vision and she was having trouble articulating it. She kept getting caught up on logistics and plans or whatever. So I gave her 2 minutes on the clock and just had her draw what her vision was going to be. And she came up with an amazing metaphor that just was a shift for her.
Wow, I love it. I love it. Now, what if someone suffers from ICD, which is I can't draw syndrome, which many of us do, and yet you have the Sandy challenge, right? We're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. So with that, I'm going to move full steam ahead. This webinar could very often, workshop could be 3 hours or a full day. I want to give you the best of today without necessarily overloading you, but I want to give you a sampling of ways to use visuals and think about visuals. So the first thing is, the big question is, why visuals? Why is this the centerpiece of my TED Talk, my book, and all of my work? So think about this. We're all looking at this image right now. If you can't find your keys, what do? We watch a mental movie of where was the last place I saw them? Where was the last place I used them? Where might I have put them down, right? Oh, what is that person's name? You're watching a movie. Where did I see that person in what other movie or TV show? We're always thinking that that person's name is on the tip of my tongue. All of these things are in our mind, and when we're trying to recapture those thoughts, we are leveraging the visual side of our brain. We're trying to picture the past to interpret the present, right? So the reason visuals are so powerful, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, and these are 3 words that rhyme. When you use visual imagery or visual language, it helps to capture people's attention, increases comprehension, and boosts retention. So if you use a visual image, it gets people to focus. Like right now, our eyes, because of the way our brains are wired, we're almost magnetically drawn to this image of this picture of this guy's head, right? Visuals get us to get our focus and capture our attention. Comprehension, when you're talking about something that people can not only hear but see, it increases their understanding. And also visuals get locked into our brain in a way that words alone don't. So it increases our attention. So if you want people to pay attention, understand, and remember, using visual imagery and visual language will help us to do that. Now I see a few people furiously scribbling. Just so you know, you're going to get a PDF copy of my slides afterwards. So if you miss anything, do not worry about it. And there will be a video as well. You can always rewatch anything that you missed. So I mainly want you to focus on being here with us, be here now today. So let me give you a real life example of this. This is one of the suggested reading lists for my NYU class, right? For my management and leadership class. This is the same list, right? So if you put them side by side, which one draws your attention? Which one will increase your understanding? Which one will you remember? When I do a test of this, if I show up the text list, put that up on the screen, people remember maybe 3 of the titles. When they put up the book covers, people remember 5 or more, right? So just the power of a picture. So when visuals and text are battling it out, when our metaphorical left brain, right brain are battling it out, the right brain always wins. And the reason I know this is true is because I've watched this little GIF or GIF hundreds of times, and the guy on the right always wins. So that scientifically proves that this theory is correct. But if you want the real science behind it, there's a lot of science. In fact, I'm going to shut the doodlers off for a second because it's visually distracting. The picture superiority effect, if you look it up, just Google it, says that pictures are superior to text. When images and text battle it out, pictures win. That's just the way our brains are wired. You can dive into the science, but that's the headline. Dual coding theory, and that's D-U-A-L as in 2, as opposed to D-U-E-L as in the duel we were just watching. Dual coding theory says that when we use text and images in combination, it's more powerful and effective than either on their own, right? So we want to look for ways to leverage both. So I'm going to give you some examples of this shortly. But think about this. Would you link in with someone on LinkedIn who you didn't know if there was no headshot? Would you buy something on Amazon or eBay just from the title and description if there was no picture, right? Would you, are you more likely to read a blog post that has a visual image that's color or black and white or none? It's usually the color one, right? So again, our brains are drawn towards color. If you were a cave person walking through the jungle and you heard something, what do? We turn around to look to see what it is. That's just the way our brains are instinctively wired. We're wired visually, and as we're going to talk about later, we're also wired as humans for story. So now I want to introduce you to the centerpiece of my workshop. I'm going to introduce to you now my 4 ways to think and communicate more visually. Here they are, and they each have a visual icon to represent. So the first one is using visual imagery and drawing. The second one is using mental models and frameworks. The third is using metaphor and analogy, and the 4 is using storytelling and humor, if and when appropriate. I could spend all day, all week talking about this, but I want to give you the headlines today just so you understand it and understand the distinctions, but also when used in combination, all of these are even more powerful and more effective. So you've already seen examples. So first, visual imagery. I showed you a visual image of the coach, right? I could have just said it, but I showed it to you. I also could have drawn it. Again, as you can see, I am not the greatest artist in the world, but this is not too bad, right? For someone who can't really draw. We get better, like anything. Drawing is a skill that takes practice. So that's one example, using visual imagery and drawing. I also, models and frameworks, I talked about how coaches get people from point A to point B. That's a mental model or framework. Metaphor and analogy, I talked about visual coaching being a new frontier. It's something that's out there that we haven't really explored yet because it's so new, and you could be a visual coaching pioneer if you start doing this before everyone else does. And storytelling and humor, I told you the story, the history of the origin of the word coach. I'll be telling you some other stories, and hopefully there was a little humor involved as well with some of the visual imagery. So right there, you saw examples of all four of these, and we're only, not even halfway through our session today. So let's take a deeper dive now into some real life examples of each of these four. So I just wanted, this is like a big overview so that it really sinks in. So visual communication goes back to caveman times, right? People were drawing on cave walls before the written word, possibly even before the spoken word. People were probably grunting while sketching out these amazingly beautiful cave drawings, right? Egyptian hieroglyphics, pictograms, the alphabet evolved from pictograms. And as some of my students from China always tell me, Chinese language and Asian languages are very much come out of using visual imagery and iconography in their alphabet, right? And in 1999, the emoji was created, right? So this is the latest version. So this is the history and evolution of visual communication over the last 46,000 years plus in 3 visual images. So let's talk about a few more recent real world examples. So I'm just going to touch on these. If we use a visual metaphor, like that's just the tip of the iceberg. When you first meet someone, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The beginning of a book or a movie is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, this could represent what? The iceberg represents here's what we see and or know, and here's what we don't, and represents the fact that there's a lot more, probably 90% more that we don't know than what we do. It could also represent danger ahead, as in the Titanic, right? What are the dangers lurking beneath the surface that we can't see? So this is such a common expression that's just the tip of the iceberg that we don't always picture the iceberg in our mind, but hopefully now going forward, you will. A map, like the New York subway map, is a visual representation. It's a mental model. I'm going to talk about mental models shortly. It's a visual representation of the layout. So if you notice the color coding of the subway lines, if I say, here's how to get to my apartment on the Upper East Side from Times Square, you would take the Q train, the yellow line, up to the Upper East Side. That is more effective than if I just gave you the instructions without showing you a map. So that's the power of using maps as a visual. We could talk for hours about data visualization and using pictures to represent numbers. So I just want to mention that today. And then visual checklists. I use a lot of visual checklists. So for example, today I made sure I had my clicker and my water and my timer. It's so much more effective to look at this and say, and scan it and say, do I have everything I need, versus looking at a bullet point list where I have to read each word. So the power of visuals in a checklist can't be understated. That's why in the seat backs on airplanes, they have the emergency exit instructions. They're visual pictures, right? They're not just, it's not a 30-page textbook. It is visual images that show you what to do in case of an emergency. So as I mentioned, a map is a mental model, and we're going to talk about mental models shortly. But visuals can also be props. For example, I might ask the question, what are you curious about today? I might ask a coaching client, I'm curious about something, let me ask you. Or I may ask a client, how flexible are you? Are you willing to try something new and different? Are you willing to bend over backwards to try something different? Or with this one, if you don't open your mind to new possibilities and create the space for new ideas and approaches, I know it's hard. Here I disappear, it's my disappearing act. But if you open this up, you can see there's more space for new ideas and new possibilities. So just using props and icons, like how curious are you, how flexible are you, and how open-minded are you, are great coaching questions that are made even more powerful by the use of visual imagery or physical objects. Body language and facial expression, that's another way that we communicate, and we also as coaches interpret messages from our clients. We could spend hours just talking about body language and facial expressions. But here's the thing, in order to communicate visually, you first need to think visually. We need to think about, all right, what's the best story, metaphor, model that will help the other person see what I'm saying. So I may ask a client, how are you feeling right now? Here's a real life example. When my mother was in the hospital and she's okay now, but there was this chart on the wall where the nurses would ask her how much pain she was in. If you notice, there's numbers and there's words, but also what I noticed was they had these images, right? Look at the color coding. This is dual coding theory taken to the next level. This is tri-coding, right? They use numbers, words, and images to ask a patient a question, how are you feeling today? And if you notice the color coding, it parallels what? If you want to put it in the chat box. What does the red, yellow, green color coding of this model remind you of? Who's the first who could put it in the chat box? Why red, yellow, and green as opposed to pink, purple, and whatever? Right, it's a traffic light, right? So what they're doing is they took visual imagery or visual messaging that already exists that people are familiar with, but repurposed it in another context to help communicate more effectively. So some of you may already use stop, start, continue in your coaching practice, as I do. And I always think about the traffic light. And this is one of my coaching models that I use. I ask a client to put 5 words that describe themselves, etc. But I also ask them, continue. What's working that you want to continue? What's not working that you want to stop? And what's something that you may want to start doing? Those are 3 of my top 8 coaching questions when I first meet with a client. Plus, in addition to the, including the magic wand question, if you can wave them magic wand and change something overnight, what would it be? So I use stop, start, continue all the time for feedback as well as in my coaching practice. And this is written about more in chapter 20 of my book. How are you feeling right now? This is one way I ask my clients. I may say, how are you feeling right now? Pick the emoji that represents your mood today. Someone may say, I'm in a really good mood. Something great happened. Or he or she may say, you know what, I had a really rough day. I'm almost in tears. Or someone else may say, I'm really exhausted, right? The power of using visual imagery and emoticons like this is it helps to trigger a thought and emotion, but then you ask the follow-up question, all right, why did you pick C7? What's going on in your life, right? So I love this because it's a great trigger or prompt for getting people to open up and talk. Another way, as was mentioned earlier, I think it was Sandy who mentioned, draw how you're feeling. When my book first came out, I was doing a workshop, I was feeling on top of the world, but there was another day that I was burnt out and zoomed out. And I felt like I was going to fall asleep at my desk, right? The forcing yourself to, or not forcing, but nudging yourself to draw is a great way of capturing emotions of yourself or your client. So drawing, if you ask a group of business professionals how many of you could draw, most say, no, I can't. But if you ask a group of kids, they all say, yes, I can, right? So what's the difference? Is it have we lost our skills or our confidence to draw over the last 30, 40, or 50 years, right? So if we put drawing back on our radar, metaphor, by the way, we could pick up a pen, even if you have ICD, I can't draw, always have your colored markers within arm's reach, because you never know when you're going to need to draw something or get up at a flip chart. So you can see my drawing skills are not great, but over the years, I've gotten much better. You can see my drawings of the stagecoach and the 2 people talking. These are just rough sketches, but again, it just comes with practice. So there's a saying that he or she who wields the pen wields the power. We want to give people the power of the pen and inspire them to be able to get up at a whiteboard or a flip chart and draw things out or draw the napkin sketch. Speaking of which, here's a little trivia question. What industry-leading business got its start with this legendary napkin sketch drawn in a Texas bar in 1967? In the chat box, let's see if anyone knows the answer to this trivia question. Napkin sketching trivia. Anyone know? I'll give a little hint. I'm going to give a slightly bigger hint. Southwest Airlines, Kyler, nicely done. Yes, I figured out how to do it. Here, let's go back to this. I just figured out how to do this special effect. How fun is that? Let's do that one more time. There we go. Visual effects. You don't want to overdo it because it gets people nauseous and it gets, it gets it's overdone. But for the purpose of this, we're just having some fun and showing what's possible. In a Texas bar in 1967, Rollin King was sitting with Herb Kelleher and said, what if we created a small commuter airline that just connected these 3 cities? And that's how Southwest Airlines was born. Herb Kelleher, one of the great CEOs of the 20th century, just passed away a couple of years ago. But think about this. In order to draw this napkin sketch, in order to draw this, Herb Kelleher and Rollin King had to have a mental map of this. right? So we need to have a mental map of reality in the big picture if we want to communicate things in a smaller, more concise way. And when you get the slides, there's a number of clickable links to articles and videos. Here's the article about Southwest Airlines if you want to read more about the napkin sketch story. But here's one of my real life stories. I'm not going to go into all the details. I talk about it in one chapter in my book, but one of my clients was wrestling with an issue where he had the head of the Eastern Division, head of the Western Division for his company. It wasn't working out. And I just threw out, what if instead of East and West, you made it North and South? And he said, I can't believe it. That's the answer. He didn't even think about it, didn't even register to him. But as a coach, I thought it was a stupid question. I thought it was so obvious that I wasn't even going to say so. But when I threw it out there, he said, it didn't even register that that was a possibility. So until I drew out this napkin sketch, he didn't even think about it. So I tell this story in how my 30-second napkin sketch helped solve a client's multi-million-dollar problem. So again, this is not just fun and games. This is real business problem solving techniques that we're talking about. I do another exercise, and I wrote an article for Inc. magazine. Can you draw what your company does? And if you click on the link when you get the slides, you can read the article. But what if you had to draw what a coach does? How would you communicate visually what a coach does? I'm not going to ask you to do that right now. You could do that as a separate assignment, but I want to give you something similar just to kind of help to give you some drawing practice. You could do the what does a coach do? How would you draw that later on? But for right now, take out a piece of paper and a pen. And I'm going to ask you to do this drawing exercise in 2 minutes. Draw a picture of an effective leader. What does leadership look like to you if you had to illustrate it? So take 2 minutes on the clock and go. Another 45 seconds. Okay, a few more seconds, just wrap it up. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can always finish it. You can still hang it on your refrigerator when we're done if you want to color it in. But for right now, do your best job in the next 15 seconds to finish up. All right, time is up. I'm going to ask for 2 volunteers to show us your pictures. Who wants to do a little show and tell? Hold it up to the camera, show us what you drew, and explain your drawing to us. Someone who hasn't spoken yet, who wants to just turn on your mic and show us your picture and explain it to us. Who's going first?
Jeff here.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
I'm not sure if you can see, my leader has a vision to take people to where the stars are and what the future is going to be. But first they have to surmount a challenging peak. And so the leader is looking over his shoulder and saying, come with me this way. This is going to be great.
Great, I love it. Thank you, Jeff. So great metaphor. So there's the stars, there's the mountain, right? There's all of these leadership metaphors tied in. We'll do 2 more. Who's next? Jan.
All right, so I have combined text with visuals, and I'm not the best at drawing. I said 1, 2, 3, 4 things. This leader, number 1, share the vision, the star. Number 2, pull the right people together. Number 3, remove the barriers. I drew a rock and removing it. And number 4 is, yay, celebrate.
Excellent, I love it. Thank you. So see what you could do in under 2 minutes. Even, Jan says she can't draw. I thought that was pretty good, right? So it's like, again, it's not about artistic. These are not going in the Museum of Modern Art. These are just for the purpose of illustration to get an idea out of your head into someone else's so we could see what you're saying. So that was perfect, Jan. Thank you. One more. Let's get one more. Someone we haven't heard from yet. Wendy, how about show us what you have?
So I tend to lean towards servant style leadership. And
Okay.
so my leader's on the stairs following everybody up behind, and everybody up here is happy and feeling successful, and the leaders behind them cheering them on.
Great, I love it. I love it. So what's interesting is just think about for yourself, what did you draw and why? right? There had to be, and again, to communicate visually, you first need to think visually. You have to get some metaphor, some concept of leadership, and then translate that into some kind of visual. So it's always good to reflect on what we're thinking and why. So I've done this exercise hundreds of times, and I wish I could have heard from everyone, but we only have a short time together today. These are very common drawings. Whether you notice, there's, leaders have big ears because they're supposed to listen. Leaders are taller than their followers, or in some ways higher or bigger. There's a watch for time management. Here, there's a lot of words and details. But also, what do you notice? Petra put it down. They're all men, right? So I got this idea for this exercise from a New York Times article that said, picture a leader, is she a woman? Most people will draw a man, including women. Researchers investigate the consequences. So what's the impact of that is when you think leadership, the first thing you think of is a middle-aged white male in a business suit who looks like Don Draper from Mad Men, right? If that's our picture of leadership, how does that impact who gets heard, who gets invited to meetings, who gets promoted, who gets hired, right? If we want to change the reality in the spirit of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we need to change our mental models and our pictures of what leadership is supposed to look like. So this is a powerful illustration. I see a lot of smiles of recognition, right? So so the question then becomes, how do we change the picture, right? So that's beyond the scope of today's workshop, but this just reminds us is that what we picture is what manifests itself in reality. So this is a real powerful example of that. So we could talk about this for hours. And I talk about this, I do this with my students in my classes, and people hit themselves in the head saying, I can't believe it. I'm all about women's empowerment. And then I drew a man in a business suit, the first thing I thought of when leaders. So we need to change the image of leaders. And one of the ways of doing that is through painting a picture that leadership comes in all sizes, shapes, colors, gender, etc. So again, this is not about your drawing abilities, it's about effectiveness. Napoleon even said a good sketch is better than a long speech, although he probably said it in French. I don't know if he spoke any English, but the bottom line is picture is worth 1,000 words. That expression has been around for thousands of years, going back to Confucius or longer. So there's reason for that. So think about this. If this was a full day workshop, we would now put you in breakouts and ask you to share specifically how you use imagery and drawing, but just for yourself, just reflect on it and think about, okay, how can I use imagery and drawing and props in my coaching practice? And now we're going to go on to the second category. And as fast as we've been going, I'm going to speed up a little bit. Some things we're just going to touch on, other things we're going to take a little more time on, but I want to make sure we still have time, around 20 minutes at the end, for conversation. So let's talk about mental models and frameworks. We all know the saying, think outside the box, right? It's become a cliche, but you can't think outside the box until you have a box with something in it, right? Why do we put things in boxes? Because mentally, it helps us to categorize, to put things into systems and processes and shapes, because life is messy and complex. That doesn't mean we put people in boxes, but if we could put ideas into boxes, whether it's a matrix, a Venn diagram, pyramid, a company's org chart is a visual representation of the hierarchy and reporting structure, right? We use mind maps and storyboards and Post-its and affinity diagrams, process maps. We use all of these different models in the HR and coaching field and in the business world, right? I love this quote by this guy, this statistician named George Box. I love that his name is Box, since we're talking about frameworks. He said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the reason they're wrong is because they're visual representations of reality, but they are not reality. So a model or a map, as I mentioned before, a model or map will help us solve a problem, even if it's wrong in many other ways, right? So that's a good point to think about, is if the model's wrong, create a better one, but there is no perfect one, right? So if you Google coaching models, you will see a lot of different coaching models. The most common and popular is the GROW model. I don't know if most people are familiar with the GROW model, but there's others like CLEAR and some of the others here. But think about what models you use, but also do some research and find other models that work for you that you could start to incorporate into your coaching practice. The GROW model, if you are not familiar with it, is what's my goal? What's the current reality? What are some options, and what will we do? What actions will we take, right? So that's a beginning, middle, and end kind of model, which parallels this from earlier today, right? So the goal is the point B, the reality is our point A, and the options and what will we do are how we're going to get from point A to point B. So again, this is a mental model or mental framework and a tool that will help us get our clients from where they are to where they want to be and how we can help them get there more efficiently and effectively than they would on their own. I have numerous models that are in my book, in my coaching practice, in my classes. This is just a sample of them. The one that's most popular and most powerful is my passion skill matrix model, which I do whole workshops on. Don't have time to talk about it today, but it's in chapter 17 of my book. And if you want to download this chapter for free, just go to toddcherches.com/passion. And again, you'll get the slides. So when you get the slides, you can just click on this link. It'll take you right there. So this is a free chapter, and you're welcome to add this model to your coaching toolkit. So as I mentioned before, a map is a mental model, right? And the map is not the territory. That's a famous saying by the philosopher Korzybski. And he's the one who created the idea of general semantics. So I can't even go into that, but it's very closely related to visual thinking. But the bottom line is maps are a visual representation of reality. So when I mentioned to someone I was doing a workshop webinar for ICF Orange County, they said, "Where's Orange County?" So to explain Orange County to a New Yorker who didn't know where it was, I said, well, here's where we are, right? This is where Orange County is. It's between LA and San Diego. He's like, oh, okay. Now, if we zoom in on it, right? We could say, oh, if you've ever been to Disneyland or Huntington Beach or Knott's Berry Farm, or, this is where it is. So sometimes we need to zoom in and sometimes we need to zoom out, right? But if I had just shown him this without this, he wouldn't have known where I was talking about. So sometimes from a visual thinking perspective, sometimes we need to look through a telescope, sometimes through a microscope, right? Sometimes we need to look far and wide and into the future. Sometimes we need to look down and deep into the details, right? We need to be able to pull in, and zoom out. And I say sometimes we need to look through a kaleidoscope and see all the colors of the rainbow and see things in a totally new light, right? So this is just an example of how to use visual imagery to explain things and how you can use visuals. And speaking of maps, I do a whole thing on this. What's wrong with this map? The first reaction is what? That's not the way we're used to seeing it, right? So people say, oh, it's upside down. But if you think about it, we are in a globe floating in space. So is there an upside down or not? Or is it just our perception of what's up and what's down? So there's nothing wrong with this map. And yet everything is wrong with this map at the same time, depending on what you need it for, what you're using it for. And I won't even go into the details. Some countries may not exist anymore. Borders change all the time. But the whole idea is if we can map things, we could see them more clearly. But the map doesn't solve the problem. It just initiates a conversation in a visual way and helps us to find where we're going. Because again, a map is a model and all models are wrong, though some are useful. So think about how you use models and frameworks in your coaching practice. Now we're going to get into this fun part. Not that that wasn't fun enough, but I love this part about being a poetry major, English literature major. I love metaphors and analogies, but it's not just for poets and songwriters. We use metaphors and analogies all the time. Nanor mentioned earlier today how she uses metaphors. So I just want to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, visual thinking in a nutshell, right? That just means in a small, concise way. We use this kind of language all the time. I talked about framing your idea or reframing an idea, but I didn't talk about the light bulb. The light bulb is so often used to represent an idea that we don't even notice it or think about it. So a little light bulb trivia: when and where did the light bulb as a visual for an idea first originate? In the chat box, let's see who can get this one. Connor, do you know this one too? All right, so let's, who knows the answer to this one? Let's see, take your best guess. 3, 2, 1. Warner Brothers cartoons, great guess, Edison. So it actually came from Felix the cat. Whenever Felix was thinking of something, the animator would draw above his head what he was thinking. And think about this. This was in the 1920s, exactly 100 years ago. The light bulb had just been invented and popularized, and from Edison and spreading for not that long. So the light bulb was an innovation at that time. And yet, if you look at the two images, we're using almost the same image with the filaments and everything, even though there are newer versions of light bulbs, those curly Q ones and fluorescence, but we still use this light bulb to represent an idea because it's become universal. To save my voice, I'm not going to talk about, read these to you, but take a second. This is what metaphors and analogies do, as I shut off this alarm from ringing again and take a sip of water. This is the power of metaphors. So let's give you some real life examples, how you can make the invisible visible. We talked about visual coaching. The expression, this is the key to success. There is no key, there is no door, right? But we use this phrase all the time. We all know this one, right? You give a person a fish, they'll eat well today, teach them to fish, they'll eat well for the rest of their lives. As coaches, we're trying to help people to fish for themselves. If you're a career coach, we talk about people's career paths, although mine was a career roller coaster with lots of ups and downs, twists and turns, exhilarating highs, and terrifying plummets. A career path implies that it's laid out for you in advance, but in any career, we come to what? A fork in the road where we may need to make a decision and choose which way we're going to go, right? Burnout, one of the hottest topics out there, but do you really think about where it comes from? We're tired, we're exhausted, we're fried, we're like a candle with one tiny flickering ember left, right? When you think about burnout, how are we going to keep this candle from going out, right? That's something that we need to think about, is the metaphor of the candle. I use a lot of baseball analogies because I'm a big baseball fan, but what if I'm talking to someone who's not a baseball fan? If I'm talking to someone from Europe, if I'm talking to someone from Canada, I might use hockey, or someone from Europe, I may use soccer/football. India, I may talk about cricket or talk about rugby with someone from Australia or New Zealand. Notice in the visuals the gender and ethnic diversity. A lot of times we use images of people who look like us. And if we're not aware and always thinking in terms of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, we're gonna forget, and we're gonna alienate people. So we want to be as inclusive as possible. And one way to do that is to use inclusive metaphors and imagery in our work. So for example, today you are in Orange County. So here's your orange tree, right? So using nature is a great metaphor. Planting the seed for an idea, getting to the root of a problem, going out on a limb, branching out in new directions, seeing what ideas bear fruit. The sky is the limit. Right there, I use 6 visual images and metaphors related to nature that anyone of any culture or gender could relate to. So this one, life is like what? In the chat box, fill in the blank. Box of chocolates. And why is that? Lori, you got it first. And why is it like a box of chocolates, or how? Because you never know what you're going to get. When I show this to my students, no one gets it right. If you're a 25-year-old female from China, you've never seen Forrest Gump. You don't know what life is like. You don't know who Tom Hanks is, right? So something that we take for granted as baby boomers or Gen Xers, and for people from other cultures, don't always get what we're talking about. So even if you don't, a visual will help to communicate that. But this is the exception to why life is not like a box of chocolates. And why is that? What's special about the Whitman sampler? It's the first one to do what? Come with, Lori said, to come with a key, right? So whoever came up with this idea was so brilliant. They created a mental model or framework to help people identify what was in each of the chocolates, right? If I had this growing up, my brother would not have taken a bite out of each one and put it back when he was looking for the cherry and got the molasses, right? So this is a brilliant example of using visual communication. I apologize, I ate half the chocolate while I was taking these pictures, but you get the message that if we can use visual imagery and visual communication, notice the dual coding, right? It represents the shape, the circle, square, rectangle, and also uses the words, the text, to identify what's inside, what we can't see, what's beneath the iceberg. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it as a common expression. If I use this, I use the Brooklyn Bridge, but when I was doing this workshop with a group in London, I used the Tower Bridge, and with a group in San Francisco, I used the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Use the bridge to help bridge the gap between people, between speakers and listeners, by speaking the language of your stakeholders. Tony Bennett, when he left his art in San Francisco, he did not physically leave his organ behind, he left his love behind, right? So that is a metaphor. So make sure you differentiate between a literal image and a visual image. Don't give your spouse or significant other this Valentine. I don't think they will enjoy it. It's the symbol, not the real one, that we're looking for in this situation. So don't do this. The red line circle with the line through it, we all know that was what? Don't do it, right? This is a visual communication that is universal. We all know don't do it when we just see that. Although when we see a communication like this, it's a little confusing. So be careful when you're sending mixed messages, because you stop here, you're pretty much stopped there for all eternity. We talked about the bridges. A textbook I had in college was called Bridges Not Walls. The stones or bricks could be used to build a bridge that connects people, or walls that divide us. So words, like bricks, can be used for multiple purposes. And lastly, as my father used to say when we were driving in the car, always have a pad and pencil with you, because you never know when you may come across a sign that says, draw a bridge. That's one of those dad jokes that you will never forget. From now on, the rest of your life, when you see a sign that says draw a bridge, you are going to laugh, and the people in the car are going to wonder why. So take it from me. I apologize for that, but there you go. So that is visual imagery, and then mental models and metaphors. This was just the what? Tip of the iceberg, because I have a million more of these where these came from. But think about how you could use metaphors and analogies in your coaching. I have one last piece before we open up to questions. So let's just talk about storytelling very briefly. Stories. In the beginning, once upon a time, or a long time ago in the far galaxy, far, far away, stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. What is a story? It's a narrative. It's a spoken or written account of connected events. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. There are villains, victims, and heroes. There's always a goal or a quest, and there's barriers, obstacles, and challenges that stand in the way. There's a resolution. There's a journey that the story takes us on of exploration and discovery that we could see in our mind's eye. Stories are human, and they humanize us. They help us to connect and to empathize. They teach us lessons, and they can transform us. There are origin stories, success and failure stories, and cautionary tales. Each of us is the hero of our own life story. And as coaches, our job is to help our clients write a new or better story that will help them to a happier ending. We want everyone to live happily ever after. That doesn't always happen, but we can at least aspire and strive for that. What do we mean by visual storytelling? It's basically painting a picture with words, right? Whether it's using images or just language, we're trying to create a mental movie in the minds of others. Well, as we're talking or as we're listening, we want people to visualize what is being said so that they can see what we're saying. And even if you're not Martin Luther King Jr., who's the greatest visual communicator of all time, and I wrote a blog post, if you click on this link, you can read about why he's the king of visual communication. We're all storytellers, right? Bill Nye, the science guy, said that everyone you will ever meet knows something you don't, and that includes ourselves and also our coaching clients. Our job as coaches is to not only be good storytellers, but good story listeners and help to draw out the stories of our clients and to remind them that when it comes to their life story, the future is unwritten and they hold the pen. So as I wrap up my content part of this, I just want to sum up. Those are my 4 ways to think and communicate more visually. The first 2 are more visual to the eye, while the last 2 could also be visible to the ear, right? Whether we're using visual images or visual language, when we use them in combination, that is the magic formula or the magic combination. So if we can help others to see the invisible, we can inspire them to do the impossible. And that's what we're trying to do as coaches. So just to close out, as you continue on your visual coaching journey, I want you to think about what you could do to be a more visual coach going forward. And to remember this quote from Marcel Proust, and I took this picture, by the way, while I was on the Staten Island ferry passing the Statue of Liberty. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. So hopefully everyone is leaving here today seeing their coaching practice and their clients with new eyes and will be a more effective visual coach. So with that, we're going to hit the Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over to Petra, and I'm going to take a breath and some water. And we have about 20 minutes left, so perfect timing. Thank you.
Whoa, this was a lot. And Todd, it was phenomenal. I think
Thank
we're
you.
all catching a breath here for a second. And what's obvious for me is, hearing you is really how biased we are towards talk and coaching. So this was a nice refresher of how much more we have available to really help clients focus and engage and mobilize, influencing emotions and beliefs and motivate action through visual tools. I want to just give everyone a moment here maybe to think. We didn't have anything so far in the chat. I know you all were just really, like myself, probably keeping up with all this wonderful information that Todd shared here. So maybe just, give it a few seconds, go through what maybe stood out, what you would love to dive in a little bit. We have, as Todd mentioned, we have a good 20 minutes here to join the discussion, and thankfully have Todd to lead the way with any questions that come up. So on that note, I'll give everyone a few seconds here, and feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure they all get mentioned and looked into.
Yeah, I'd love to take any questions or hear what resonated with you, or what are you going to do differently going forward? Or I know I packed a lot in. This was, I talked fast, as I said. But hopefully this will give you an overview and trigger some ideas, maybe things that one of the things I want to say is a lot of you are already doing a lot of these things, but hopefully now you're more aware of it, and you could be more strategic and intentional about trying some new things or using, and it's fun. It makes it interactive and fun to try new things in new ways with clients. Keeps things fresh and keeps us fresh. So I'd love to hear any thoughts, questions.
This is going to seem so silly now that we've listened to you, but I use a lot of visual imagery, metaphors, that sort of thing in my coaching. I use the balance wheel with a lot of coaches. Never even occurred to me to hold up a piece of paper and draw it like Andrew did. Like, never even crossed my mind that I could do that. I have them do it, but we're not looking at the same thing when we do that. And it struck me how much more powerful that can be for me to just be participating by drawing my own circle.
Yeah, how many times I'm facilitating, I give instructions, and then people go into the breakouts, and then they say, wait, what are we doing again? If you use visuals that people can look at, just as Wendy is saying, right? If you can model what we want them to do, they're going to be more effective. And it saves that, what are we going to do syndrome. So thank you, Wendy, for saying that.
I have a question. So I'm a relatively new coach, but when you have a new client, how do you begin to assess what would resonate with them out of all the things that you shared with us today? Where would you start?
Yeah, well, all of these are just tools in our toolkit, and like any toolkit, it's like we pull, that's saying if you the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we don't want to say, all right, this is the only tool I use. What I usually do when I'm meeting with a client during the chemistry call and saying, are we the right fit? They know going in that this is my methodology. I give them some examples as we're talking, and it doesn't resonate with everyone. Some people say this is not for me. I don't like, which is fine. So you want to work with clients who say, wow, this is exciting and interesting. This is a new way of thinking, and I want to be. So that's what I would say is I know I overwhelmed and overloaded because there was so much I wanted to talk about in 90 minutes. But again, this is the tip of the iceberg. You can dive into one thing or 10 things. You could say, I just want to focus on, I love the metaphors, or someone else may say, I love the visual models. So start with what resonates with you, what's already in your toolkit, and say, all right, just add one or two things occasionally. And before you realize it, you have a whole visual coaching toolkit.
We had one here that I like about the, being more aware of diversity. I think that was a wonderful point you made. Certain things speak to certain audiences, and to be mindful how that translates to your particular client. We had Andrew here with the hardest one for me is the storytelling. Could you take a bit more time on that? Andrew, if you want to put yourself on mute and just say maybe what exactly you got curious about there, that'll be fine.
Well, yeah, I really, the first three of your pieces were very familiar to me. I use it all the time. I do quite a few seminars, do a lot on the flip chart and so on. But in storytelling, I'm trying to get a sense of how you use that graphically or visually.
Yeah, I mean, if a client says, they're having an issue with their boss, I do executive coaching, leadership development coaching. I'll say, well, tell me about a time my boss is a jerk. Why do you say that? Give me an example. Tell me a story about a time that boss did something made you think this person's a jerk, right? We elicit stories from people, right? But also we may share our own story. Oh, I once had a boss who did something similar. Here's what happened. Now, I know some people say coaches shouldn't share their own stories. That's the whole philosophical conversation I want to get into today. But if someone says, if we're looking for trends and patterns, you may say, tell me more. Give me another example. I always talk about the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Those are the 6 questions, right? The 5 W's and the H. So tell me who was involved, what happened, when and where did this happen, how did this come about, or why do you think it happened, and then how did you address it, right? So there's all kinds of prompts that we could use to pull stories out of people and share stories, but stories bring things to life and help to bubble up to the surface. So I think it's both sharing our stories, but also pulling stories out of our clients. So there are so many books on storytelling. In fact, the whole bottom shelf of my bookshelf, I have about 20 books just on storytelling. So that's what I'd say. It's like anything, read about it, look for TED Talks. There's so many good TED Talks on the power of storytelling. So like anything, it's a skill that we could develop with awareness and working at it.
Well, what I got when he started talking right away is that, you know, the penny dropped. Oh, it's not a drawing that I do visually. It's imagining, picturing it in their head, which I kind of wasn't seeing it that way as I use a visual term.
And Andrew just used the penny dropped metaphor, right? So we use metaphors. Like I pluck metaphors out of the air, like I cannot see them. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll start noticing all how often metaphors are used. I forget what the percent is, but it's like 20 or more percent of our language is metaphorical, and we don't even think about it or notice it. I was talking to a client, and he was talking about an issue that no one was talking about, but that was, you know, like taking up everyone's attention. I said, oh, so you're referring to the elephant in the room? So I pulled this up, and he laughed out loud. He said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like we have this gigantic elephant in the room that no one's talking about. So again, the use of that metaphor. But when I showed him this animal, he laughed out loud, and it kind of lightened his mood and enabled him to talk about what that elephant was that he was previously hesitant about talking about. So again, you have to gauge with some clients. If I pulled that out with a CEO, they'd probably hang up on me. So you have to know your client, what resonates with them. And that's why you have to have a variety of tools in your toolkit, depending on what your client, what will resonate with your particular client.
Great. Segue into Sandy. She had a question about, do you have any preferred sites that you get your images from?
Yeah, a lot of people just pull things up off Google Images, which is not quite officially legal. I usually use Shutterstock. I use so many images that I subscribe to a few paid services that you pay a monthly fee and you can get X number, but there's so many free sites. If you just Google free image sites, and I have a list of them, and everyone here, first of all, feel free to link in with me. Just connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to connect. But just send me a note, and I'm happy to send you a list of. I have like 3 or 5 free image sites that I tend to use. There's less on the free sites. There's less choice. That's why the paid sites. So if you use a lot, it's worth subscribing. Even if you just subscribe for a month and once you download them, because a lot of them are like copyright free, or I forget what they call it, as a Creative Commons license, where once you get them, you're allowed to use them. So. Yeah, Laurie mentioned Pixabay.
Gordon was next here. He has a question regarding using visualization in group coaching as well as individual coaching. Any comments, Todd, to the group coaching dynamic with this?
Yeah, I mean, when you use a group, like I do, if you read that Inc. article, can you draw what your company does? It's too long a story to tell, but with a group, each person had to get up and draw a picture of what their company did and how they were different from and better than the competition. And in the process of each person doing it, it brought all of these conversations out that were not happening before that. So yes, when you do it as a group, when you use any of these things, it's just another way of thinking. It gets people to think metaphorically, it gets people to share their stories. Like if you went around and said in a team building thing and said, all right, everyone tell us, think about the worst team you were ever on. I do this in my team building, my leadership class at NYU. Think about the best team you were ever on and the worst team you were ever on. What made the best one good and the worst one bad? And how did that impact you? And as each person shares their story, it creates empathy, compassion. You have to first create an environment of psychological safety where everyone feels safe to be vulnerable and share these stories. But once you do, through that short storytelling, from there, you could say, all right, now we can come up with best and worst practices as a team based on the fact that we've all been on good and bad teams. Let's capture those practices. And now if we can live these good practices and avoid the bad ones, we will have an effective team. So that's just one example of how by having people share their stories, you create community and connection.
We had Janja with a great idea too. She said when working with a leadership team, I asked them to each draw their team dynamic in a single image.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I was doing a leadership, I was doing a version of this visual, not coaching, but visual leadership workshop for a group of 20 CEOs. And can you imagine the reaction when I started handing out colored markers and big pieces of paper? They were like, what is this, kindergarten? 3 minutes into it, people were like, can I have more colors? Can we have more time? So all of a sudden, everyone was having so much fun with that. And one guy said they'd known each other for years. And one guy said to the other, until you drew out that picture, I never really knew what your company did. And now, so I've known you for 5 years, I never knew. In 3 minutes after you explain your drawing to me, I totally understand what you do and how you do it and why you do it. So that's just one example of how once you get people to pick up that pen, it captures, it's playful, right? It captures the creative side of your brain. And so often we're buried in spreadsheets and budgets and all this kind of stuff. It's fun, it's creative to be able to paint a picture of your reality in a creative way. Any other thoughts or questions or comments or applications?
While you guys are all thinking, I'm wondering, Todd, when I think about my own sessions sometimes, and you try to inspire people to, let their creativity flow, there is so much hesitation with some audiences that are probably having some experiences from back in middle school, right? When someone said you're not creative, or you can't draw, or you don't have, rhythm and can't dance, and people get so caught up in that I wonder, what do you use to kind of get people back to having confidence, right, in that skill, and actually start doing that dance or play?
Yeah, the exercises I do, draw a circle, now on top of that draw a triangle, now below that draw a rectangle. All right, now draw 2 lines beneath it and 2 lines to the side. You just drew a person. Looks like a robot or a clown, but you just drew, right? So once the hardest part, I would say the hardest part is going from 0 to 1. So go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Once the 0 to 1 part, getting a pen in someone's hand, getting them to put pen to paper, that's the hard part. Once they do, like we said, if a kid could draw, and it doesn't have to be perfect, it's literally, it's creative, it's fun, and even if you're not good at it, and if you watch my TED Talk, that I tell my origin story of how I was a project manager, I was sent to China to oversee the installation of a theme park project, and it was myself, an engineer and a mechanic, and everyone there spoke Chinese, no English. So the only option was to draw. I picked up a pen and started drawing tools that we needed, arrows, numbers, and we figured out a way to communicate with zero language other than nonverbals, body language, pointing. So I said pictures and pointing. It became Pictionary and charades, but we got this thing done without being able to speak a word of Chinese or English. So there are real practical applications of this, and sometimes it's out of necessity, right?
We have Andrew here again. Andrew, if you want to take yourself off mute, just to tell us a little bit more about what your question is about.
Well, one of the things that obviously as coaches, we're in the transformation business, and it strikes me that there must be some sort of progressive drawings or graphics or something we could use that would demonstrate a transformation, sort of to land it on the person, because often they're in their heads, they're thinking about what the problem is or whatever, and if you can draw the other side, then it creates more of an emotional impact. And it's just something I'm curious about, whether if you can say anything about how to do that effectively.
Yeah, man, I'm thinking as you're talking, I think it's a before and after, right? It's
yeah.
Of like here's point A, here's what does point B look like. You could, like as mentioned earlier, you could cut pictures out of a magazine and create a vision board. You have people tell a story of what a perfect day looks like 3 years from now or 5 years from now. So there's all kinds of ways of doing that. But yeah, there's about transformation. It's about going from A to B to Z. Yeah, there's no one right way of doing it, but ideally, you know, there's that saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So it's like we need to first, there's a saying that things are twice invented, once in our minds and once in the real world, right? So if you can get people to create that vision in their mind, then they can have a picture, and it can always change, right? There's that saying, shoot for the stars, you may only land on the moon or Mars, but at least you're out of this world or off this earth, right? So you can aspire to bigger things, but if you don't even have a picture, if you don't put it out there into the universe, the likelihood of it happening is reduced. So I think that's getting people to talk about it, to paint a picture of what a better future looks like. One of my chapters in my book is the 2 questions you need to ask. Will my future self thank me or blame me for what I'm about to do? And I love that question. I started doing that. I lost 36 pounds 3 years ago. And every time I went to pick up that Haagen-Dazs, I said, will my future self thank me or blame me for finishing this entire pint of chocolate peanut butter? And I said, they're going to blame me. And I didn't do it, right? So you kind of have to step out of your own body. But if you think about what will future Andrew or future Jeff or future Lori, think of what I'm about to do, you have to visualize yourself in the future and say, which action will help to lead me? Similar exercise, if you think, I don't like using the funeral eulogy because it's depressing, but if it was your retirement party, what would you want your coworkers or colleagues to say about you at your retirement party? And then what do you need to do between now and then to make that a reality? Because it's not just going to happen magically. There is no magic wand, right? You can't just wave it and say, all right, so you need to actually do the work. So this will help you actually visualize, what do I need to do to reach that destination? Lori, I see you have a magic wand as well. Great, love it.
Todd, real quick, we had David here with a question about generational differences in visual thinking. We have a few more minutes. If you could just add a few words to that, Todd.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, what's
Todd,
the question?
Yeah. Hey, Todd.
David.
So two quick things. Number one, go Yankees. I started my career as a mental conditioning coach for the Yankees. So,
wow, great.
Very cool. United in that spirit. Second piece was around thinking about the difference in generations. Like we have a generation of people, Gen Z, et cetera, who've grown up with Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Like, do you find that like the central truths of visual thinking have evolved as our mediums of engaging have, or are a lot of them still fairly similar? Just curious for any perspective you have there.
Yeah, I think younger people, just because they are digital natives, react to this more and faster than baby boomers do, just because it's innate to watch videos. If you don't know how to do something, you look it up on YouTube, you look it up on TikTok, right? So they're just oriented more visually than reading, right? So people have shorter attention spans. We're overloaded by so much information. So quicker and faster is more efficient and more effective. And visuals, because their picture's worth 1,000 words, really resonate with people of all age groups, but even more so with younger people. And similarly, images cross cultural and language barriers as well, right? So if you want to communicate with someone who has an accent, I have a little bit of a New York accent, some might say, but I talk really fast, right? But in my classes, because I use visuals, my students, many of them are international students, they love the fact that the visuals reinforce what I'm saying. So I basically embody and illustrate that dual coding theory by my words and my images support each other. So my slides have, if you notice, had very little text on them, just as they are in my classes. So I think, again, we're all as humans visually oriented, but definitely I think younger people are just brought up with quick imagery, and it really resonates with them. Thanks for asking, David. Yes.
Todd, I want to thank you at this moment for this really super energizing and thought-provoking session that we had the pleasure of having you join us for today. I wanted to hand it over to Nanor just for a couple of closing words, if need be. I know we always have a few housekeeping at the end, so that would allow us for that. And again, all of you, very, very huge thank you for joining and sharing in that wonderful experience that Todd provided here today. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Petra. Nice. Thank you for the support of the ICF Orange County team. You guys were amazing to work with, and great to meet all of you. Definitely link in with me, and we'll keep connected and keep talking.
Perfect. Todd, how many props do you have? I'm just so curious now.
Yeah, you only saw a fraction of them. I have so many. It's like, if you don't keep up with technology, you're going to become a dinosaur. It's like I have so many here. Just pull them out.
I love it. I love it. Okay, you've definitely inspired me. Thank you.
sure.
Definitely getting the book as well, Visual Leadership. And I just wanted to thank everyone for making this such an interactive session today. Thank you, Todd. Amazing. And just as a reminder, please go to our events page on 1 week from now, on September 20th. We have our credentialing series. It's part 3. It's about updated core competencies, new exam, external accreditation, and we have other upcoming events as well. And then, and just look out for our survey, which will include your CCEUs, as well as the PDF that Todd will be sharing with us, and a link to today's recording. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you.
everyone. I'll
Take care.
stay on for a minute if you ICF if you want to debrief and just chat. For a
Sure.
sec. And I'm saving the chat box so I can read the comments because I missed a lot of them.